We had a wonderful first session yesterday that Mike will give us a reprieve of. And let me just ask my co-chair for the global energy sector and co-chair for this wonderful Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank, Emma Hand, to introduce Mike McNamara, our US region CEO, and then we'll get underway.
Good morning, everyone. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Mike McNamara, the Chief Executive Officer of Dentons US, which means that he has the unenviable job of running this ship and riding herd on hundreds, if not thousands, of unruly lawyers and professionals to try to get us all pulling in one direction together. Mike was one of the earliest supporters of the Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank within Dentons, and one of the first to really understand the significance and the cross-cutting nature of smart cities and how it draws not just from the energy practice that Clint and I come out of, but cuts across a huge number of the practices of Dentons, and was really instrumental in helping us pull everybody together and get behind this effort. And I really attribute that to Mike's deep understanding of the intersection of business, law, innovation, and regulation, and how all of these issues are tied together and work together. And you know, the need for the whole firm to respond to these types of smart cities issues. Mike is one of the key drivers of innovation within Dentons and one of our best minds on what the practice of law in the future will look like and how Dentons needs to innovate in order to meet the needs of our clients and become the law firm of the future. And so I would like to hand off to Mike here, and I hope everyone will join me in welcoming him. And we're very grateful that he could be here this morning. So take it away, Mike.
Clint, Emma, good morning. Thank you. And good morning to everyone. Delighted that you are with us for day 2 of our summit. It is obviously interesting times for all of us, and to be doing this virtually instead of gathered together in Washington as we have been for 2 extraordinary summits past. But we are all adapting, and I hope you and yours are doing well. We had a great opening day yesterday. In addition to the scene setting that Clint and Emma and team gave, Joe Andrew, my partner and our Dentons Global Chairman, kicked off our summit with some exceptional remarks, really exploring the importance of connections between cities and how those connections allow cities around the world to work together to address and solve the real problems that people are facing, and problems that are obviously front and center at this moment in time, more so than almost in any other moment in history of our recollection. Joe spoke about the new dynamic that all cities and communities and those that work with cities, including everyone on this call, need to focus on. Normal, as we've been spending a lot of time discussing, implies that we'll all get back to the system that was operating before the pandemic. But I think the thought leaders on this call know that the reality is that accelerated change is upon us, and there will not be going back to a normal, but rather helping to shape what that new dynamic is in the days ahead. Clint led an exceptional discussion with Paula Gold-Williams, the president and CEO of CPS Energy, and I'm delighted that she is co-chair of our energy think tank. And Paula shared her extraordinary perspective of what it's like to lead as a CEO during this time of social unrest, and the importance of inclusion within our teams, and the importance of taking time to have meaningful and difficult conversations, and how we all can prepare for what's next in that moment of unexpected crisis. And coupling those discussions with yesterday's trend-setting national leaders and policymakers panel that overviewed how different regions and sectors are moving towards smart and connectedness in a new way, the need for creating cleaner, more sustainable energy, while also cognizant of the impacts on rural communities that we have obviously had even greater focus on here during this exceptional time, and how these events of the pandemic and the social unrest and racial injustice conversations have impacted how we define what shaping smart and sustainable communities means. As a moment of personal pride, I appreciate Emma's generous comments. I cannot be more proud of our team and the leadership of Clint Vince and Emma Hand and the entire Smart Cities team. We've had the opportunity over this past year to come together regularly, in person, at times before March, virtually connecting colleagues from around the U.S. and around the world to hear from national leaders, thought leaders, policymakers about the innovative developments that are making communities and the residents of those communities more connected, more resilient, more secure, and more environmentally conscious through the modernization of digital, physical, and social infrastructure. And these summits are really the embodiment of bringing together those conversations into one concerted, concentrated day. Our first summit flowed from a lunch where Clint and I gathered, and Clint shared with me that he had an idea. And when Clint has an idea, they're usually pretty good. I don't think, though, any of us would have thought that we would have been here at this moment in time for our third summit. And certainly none of us would have thought that we would have been doing this summit virtually. In normal times, we would have gathered for cocktails on the rooftop of our building in Washington last evening. I guess the only upside of this virtual connection is that I think that rooftop was probably about 127 degrees last night, but we may have avoided the heat, but we miss being together and we miss the physicality of that presence, which is so important to the work that we have done and the work that we continue to do. But I could not be more pleased that those initial efforts many years ago now have now led to our think tank having more than 500 thought leaders globally. And for this past year, for those roundtables and articles to have brought together that leadership where we could consistently hear that a city and community is first and foremost about people and that people connection and how we address and lead and guide, deploy new technology as part of that journey is so critical to the work that we have. And if anything, this extraordinary time that's upon us has brought focus to the critical importance of the economic corridors in our nation and the central role that localities play and will continue to play in the weeks and months ahead in responding to this moment. In keeping with the adaptability and nimbleness of this community on this line today, we added two important new pillars in the past few months. One, dealing with the pandemic and crisis response and infrastructure, a pillar that has certainly been tasked and tapped here over the weeks that have unfolded. And a second, more recently, dealing with social equity, systemic racism, and human rights. Both critical pillars to add to the very good work that this think tank and this community are bringing together. Today, as we launch the second day, we could not be more pleased that we'll hear from former Secretary of Energy, Dr. Ernest Moniz, as well as from Melanie Kenderdine, the principal of the Energy Futures Initiative, working at the intersection of technology, science, economics, and energy. They have spearheaded numerous efforts to bring these disciplines together and forge a global response to climate change and to further science-based clean energy policy among the greatest imperatives of our time, and in so doing, using their talents and skill and genius and really digging in and making sense for all of us of data about the sectors that are of such importance to us. We also then will have an opportunity to explore with some of the most exciting and interesting and innovative new developments for smart cities and connected communities, with Clint moderating an exceptional panel with some of the industry's leading experts on groundbreaking developments that are taking place in smart cities and communities around the world. And while we are connecting those communities together today virtually, we're attending from various locations around the world, I hope that each of us will have an opportunity today to take the time to connect with each other virtually. I could not be more pleased and appreciative that you have taken the time to be with us on behalf of all of our partners at Dentons and all of our leadership team, for you joining for today and the rest of our summit. And I wish each of you a great day of summiting, as cities and communities are truly leading the way for us in creating a better world. And each of you, by being here today, by your investment of time, your commitment, and your renewal together are making a difference. And Clint, my thanks to you and the entire team. And let me turn it over to you to get us underway for another great day of the Smart Cities and Communities Think Tank Summit.
Thank you for that exceptional welcome, Mike, and for your thoughtful comments, particularly when you're on vacation in Colorado this week. And we and thank you also for waking us up with such a great welcome. I'm very honored today to be able to introduce former Secretary of Energy, Dr. Ernest Moniz. Dr. Moniz is a nuclear physicist and is chairman and CEO of the Nuclear Threat Initiative. Dr. Moniz is also CEO and co-founder of the Energy Futures Initiative, together with Melanie Kenderdine, who will be our second keynote speaker today, and Joe Hazier. Ernie also was the director of the Energy Initiative at MIT, and in addition, he is the inaugural Distinguished Fellow of the Emerson Collective. Former Secretary Moniz has 9 honorary doctorates and an astonishing number of medals and awards, some from representing the highest awards offered by other countries, in addition to a long list of US distinctions. Dr. Moniz represents a really rare combination of brilliance, pragmatism, and decades of experience in adapting public policy to science. I can't think of anyone who is wiser or more accomplished in the energy industry. Ernie, thank you so much for being with us today, and you're up. You will need to just unmute, Mr. Secretary.
You are correct. And thanks, Clint, for that introduction and its very subtle statement that I've been around a long time in this business. But thanks for inviting me back to this summit. This year, I'm going to reflect briefly on the intersection of smart cities and communities with the goal of net zero carbon emissions. But rather than start with smart cities at a smart cities workshop, I'm actually going to start with the net zero. This is, after all, a rather audacious goal. And beyond that, the elephant in the room is not just about the president's cognitive test. It's about an election in 3.5 months. The fact is, neither of the candidates has what I would call a smart city platform, and maybe that's a good thing. And one could keep tending that garden, maybe a little bit in the shade. But there's a stark difference on energy and climate. One candidate is, of course, expected, if he wins, to come out of the box as president with a major agenda in climate. Certainly through executive action and perhaps through legislative vehicles as well, in particular, if the Senate were also to transition its majority rule. Now, today, I'm not making any assumptions about the winner of the election. That we'll find out in due time in November. But I guess my view is that we have to be, as a community, prepared, particularly if there is a sharp change in direction with a change in the administration. And so I think in that context, so today it's a discussion of, if you like, what if there is a change, a major change in direction in climate, a adoption of the net zero goal that is, frankly, in many ways, kind of sweeping the world. In September, for example, when UN Secretary General Guterres had his climate action workshop, just on that one day, he announced more than 100 cities around the world that were adopting the net zero goal. So to me, the question is going to be, how do we prepare to position the smart cities agenda as something that enables the net zero goal that I believe will be an overarching concern in the event of a change of administration. Again, the spirit is we need to be prepared for that possibility. And we all know today, polls, which have been wrong before, but polls do suggest that this is, in fact, a real possibility. So let me start out with some comments on what I would call the why, when, what, and how of a climate action plan in the net zero context. Of course, the why starts out with the science. And I have to say, you and Mike in particular both mentioned the COVID. And I have to say that we have learned painfully from our ongoing COVID experience the consequences of ignoring science and the facts. And we certainly cannot do that going forward with climate. And the science, even since the Paris meeting in 2015, in December 2015, so not even 5 years ago, there's been really a very dramatic change. For example, the IPCC report that pointed out the tremendous consequential differences of global warming from 2 degrees to 1.5 degrees kind of made the point that we really have to go for that more aggressive goal, which really was not the focus in Paris. In Paris, it was 2 degrees with the hope that one might do better. That associated itself with like an 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by mid-century. By no means a simple goal, but the reality is the 1.5 degree focus that has emerged in these last 4.5 years really tells you that a significant probability of reaching that goal will require the net zero goal by mid-century. So obviously, an even much more stringent goal. And that, of course, raises a serious issue of urgency and, in our view, of adopting pathways that have as much optionality and flexibility as possible. The when, well, the when is basically now because of this need of urgency. And now, of course, we are as a nation at a critical intersection of crises: climate, COVID, unemployment, racial equity and social justice, and I would add, internationally, globally fragmented alliances. So this is a set of intersecting crises that we really have to deal with, and our climate action plan will need to feature ambition, social justice, and jobs. And also, the now is because as we face this very challenging goal of net zero, we are going to need, starting now and throughout this decade for sure, what I call a supercharged innovation period in technology, in policy, and business model innovation. And there's clearly no time to waste on that. And in that supercharged innovation agenda, where will smart cities fit in? Certainly, smart cities should have a very, very important role. Again, it's up to us to prepare for that eventuality and be ready to map that out. In terms of the what, that climate action plan, again, clearly must touch all parts of the innovation agenda, from RD&D for breakthrough technologies to policies and business models that accelerate clean energy deployment and create good jobs. It must be pragmatic. It must be committed to the all of the above solutions that we've talked about before. And it must provide a toolkit for enabling regional net zero solutions, since energy resources and challenges vary substantially by region. And of course, that regional variation applies as well, specifically to cities. All of the above I mentioned, let me just say all of the above for electricity, which is a central point of discussion in smart cities, at a minimum must include advanced renewables, including things like offshore wind that will be especially important for many of our coastal cities, and many of our major cities are by no accident in coastal locations. We will need to solve electricity storage at timescales from minutes to seasons, and the answer is not batteries over that entire range of timescales. Batteries, minutes and hours, but we will need other breakthrough technologies for longer timescales. Advanced nuclear reactors, small modular and micro reactors. I would throw in fusion in addition. Carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration at very large scale. Hydrogen, associated infrastructure, smart grids, EV fast charging, CO2 pipes, hydrogen transport, the buildup of secure supply chains, including for critical minerals and metals needed for these new technologies. And of course, COVID has shown a light on this issue of re-examining global interdependencies in supply chains. And finally, in this list, I would add carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere and upper oceans using natural, technological, and hybrid solutions, again, at large scale. It's a very, very big agenda. We'll come back to the cities specifically, but right now, this is the broad agenda. Next point I would make is that while the goal of net zero economy-wide is the one being adopted increasingly for net zero by mid-century, we all know, and we've talked about this before, that the lead horse among the sectors in deep decarbonization is, again, electricity. Again, key feature of our smart cities discussion. I think that means to reach the 2050 net zero goal, we are going to have to reach that goal in electricity earlier. I would say 2040 would be the kind of goal, so that as we electrify the remainder of the, or parts of the remainder of the economy, we will have reached the net zero goal in electricity as an enabler for doing it much more broadly in the economy. Because we have to remember that electricity emissions in the United States, for example, are 28%. That would mean, doing advanced arithmetic, that there's a remaining 72% that has to be addressed for this deep decarbonization. And sectors like industry, parts of transportation, agriculture are much, much more difficult to decarbonize. I would note that the troika in my list of electricity relevant technologies, carbon capture and sequestration, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide removal, of course, will be major contributors beyond the electricity sector and also in those more difficult to decarbonize sectors. And finally, in this broad, on this broad canvas is the how. And we think that the most important word here is coalitions. We have never seen the kind of transformation in society that is sustainable without having had broad coalitions formed. And I would say the same lesson is going to port over to our discussion in smart cities, where coalitions will include all the many, many players in a city government, for example, in the private sector, who will need to come together to bring together the various infrastructures that we will need in the smart city context. We'll come back to that. The coalitions, to me, also brings up the word jobs. We are going to need a lot of job creation, particularly as we come out of this COVID-induced economic downturn, which unfortunately, is not going away anytime soon, as is becoming recognized more and more. I'd raise that here as well because at EFI, we have carried on the annual energy and employment reports. And what's important is looking over the last 5 years, one sees that the job creation in these very initial stages of an energy transition has been more than double the rate of job creation in the economy as a whole. So I would also posit that there's a good argument that the job creation agenda also feeds into the issue of, in fact, accelerating the energy transition and, of course, as we'll discuss, finding the smart city role in that. At EFI, at the Energy Futures Initiative, we turned this the Green Real Deal as kind of the framework for going forward. It's very, very challenging, but I think that's the context now in which we come to cities and the need to prepare for what could be a major political transition with regard to this country's approach to clean energy and climate. Now, I mentioned that Secretary General Guterres announced 100 plus cities last September. Many more have joined since then. Many American cities are among them. And again, the commitment is to net zero, not specifically to smart. So at meetings like this, again, I believe that we should really start with the climate goal and figure out the how and what of smart cities being an integral part of the pathway to meeting that aggressive climate goal. So how is smart going to materially help go to low carbon, while delivering, of course, the other desirable end products and new services that we've discussed many times with regard to smart cities. So really the question is, how does the climate action plan that I addressed broadly for net zero, how does that kind of scope down and apply to the framework of smart cities? Well, of course, one question is, what does net zero mean, in particular in the context of cities? And sometimes these net zero commitments by cities really have, sometimes in the bold print and sometimes in the fine print, a focus on new buildings. So new buildings will be net zero. That's very important, but it is not, of course, addressing the whole issue of the transition to net zero. By the way, the importance of buildings, we can bring out, let's just take DC as an example. As Mike said, we might have thought that we would be meeting physically in DC right now. Well, we're not, but it's perhaps worth pointing out that DC, of course, is kind of out there on the spectrum of cities in terms of it's either de-industrialization or non-industrialization. And as a consequence, the building stock in Washington, D.C. accounts for 3/4 of greenhouse gas emissions versus, say, 40% more typically nationally or globally. So certainly building decarbonization is absolutely critical in this case. It's going to be critical in other cases as well, but especially so in cities like DC. SMART is a major tool for reaching the decarbonization of buildings. Much higher efficiency, tailoring the energy requirements to the human needs and not to the building's needs, for example, very, very important. But clearly, the goal of only new buildings is too narrow. And in fact, the goal of just the building sector itself is too narrow. Because we also need to look at the remainder of the emissions, which in DC would be mainly transportation, and electrification, presumably, and multimodal transportation, micro-mobility issues will all be a big part of that. But all cities are not like DC either. And in more generally, we will have cities with industrial activities. We will have cities that will need to manage also the movement of, let's say, very heavy trucks. We will have cities that will have to manage marine transportation in their ports. And this is going to require opening the aperture to some approach to low carbon fuels. Hydrogen is a good example of what could be the answer. Green hydrogen in particular there, but we're going to need to address that. And furthermore will be the definitional issues. For example, again, in the fine print, many of the commitments to net zero exclude air travel in and out of the city. Well, is that the right definition or not? But it's certainly a big deal, and one, again, that's going to call for, I think, a very, very different approach to low carbon fuels than we have seen today. These issues of what's in and out raises the issue of what are often called scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. I think that's probably familiar to most. Scope 1 emissions are all the direct emissions for the activities that an organization or an entity has under their control. For example, the elimination of fuel combustion on site, how waste treatment is pursued, maybe producing renewable natural gas, and the like, from municipal solid treatment, water treatment, and the like. Scope 2 are the indirect emissions from production of the energy and electricity used by the organization or entity. So that gets into upstream supply chains and taking responsibility for emissions in the supply chain. For example, if natural gas is still in the mix, can we have net zero production using electric drilling and all kinds of other technologies? And scope 3 are all the other indirect emissions occurring from sources not under the direct control of the organization. Now, I think those definitional issues will be very important, and this workshop could be a good place to discuss those in the context of what does it mean for a net zero city, and therefore what does it mean for getting smart in that city. I personally think that at a minimum, if one goes all the way through scope 3, it's going to have to be a phased approach from scope 1 to scope 2 to scope 3. Now, as I mentioned, of course, not all cities are deindustrialized like DC, but of course, in discussing all of these approaches, like hydrogen, again, hydrogen is for multiple sectors: electricity and transportation, we've already noted, but of course, industry, hydrogen could play the major role in some sense as the replacement for natural gas in terms of the kinds of process heat requirements that we will need. And in tying back to that earlier agenda, because I've covered most of it, maybe the only part of it which is not going to be managed certainly within a city is the carbon capture and sequestration part. That is, the sequestration part is unlikely, I think, to be managed in the city. But just about everything else is, including the carbon dioxide removal. Net zero is not zero. Net zero means that there will be negative carbon technologies counterbalancing some residual emissions that presumably will come from the very hard to decarbonize sectors. That's very important for cities as well. But here I have to say, one has to get beyond what some would advocate as solutions only within the boundary. It clearly makes no sense for a city to offset some of its residual emissions by CDR within the city. You go where the CDR is most easily and economically accomplished. It's fundamentally an offset that cities can take responsibility for. So that's kind of the picture. I mean, I've really defined questions as opposed to providing answers in many cases. And these answers, let's face it, also are going to have very, very strong political dimensions in deciding how one draws these boundaries and therefore what the challenge is for smart cities. But in talking about things like decarbonizing industry, it's a pretty small leap to also bringing in the issues of social justice. And the point here is, in going to a largely electrified or electricity plus hydrogen city, in going to a net zero city, we should also be looking aggressively at the opportunities to address social justice. Frankly, that smart city could be ideal for addressing the needs of the physically and economically and age disadvantaged populations. The last mile for mobility, for example, would be an example of a critical issue. So I think that we should take this as an opportunity, the smart city, to address both the climate and the social justice agendas, which we must do together, and which, by the way, is the fundamental underlying principle of the Green New Deal. We provide a framework for executing it in the Green Real Deal, but it's social justice in parallel with climate that we must keep in mind. And finally, a very few words on COVID and behavioral change. We've certainly seen how behavioral change affects the energy industry significantly. There are many unanswerable questions today. Cities, by definition, are places that are naturally social distance challenged. It's clear, by definition, cities have higher population densities. And so one is at least nominally more exposed. That raises, of course, the issue of remote work, and Mike mentioned that. And clearly, it has, first of all, remote work is probably well suited to many cities, certainly DC that we've used as an example. And certainly, I agree with Mike's implication that the new normal is going to have additional remote work compared to the previous normal. But I don't believe we can answer the question today as to how much of that will persist. Will today's, I would say, productivity surprise for many in remote work, will that survive the reopening of society? Working home is one thing when there's no society outside. Working home is a different thing when there are lots of options. So will the rural choice be enhanced? I believe the answer is yes, but by how much? Not entirely clear. If it is, of course, there may be much more commercial space decommercialized in cities. Well, maybe that's transformed into residential space. Maybe there's a reduction of costs in cities. Maybe there's a big opportunity here for social justice in terms of community structures, together with opportunities for cultural activities and for other kinds of activities. So a lot of this can be enhanced by SMART, but I would argue we don't really know how this is going to turn out. And again, optionality and flexibility as we design the smart city template, I think is going to be extremely important. And in fact, the last thing I'll say in terms of uncertainty, I think the uncertainty is even much greater than I've hinted at so far. COVID-19 is the 7th significant epidemic, pandemic of this century. Every 3 years. It's the third coronavirus. We have taken 6 strikes already. We've whiffed 6 times, swinging at the pitch for improving pandemic preparedness. Will this be the 7th? I hope not. If it is the 7th, you can be sure that just as we see floods of the century every couple of years in some places, we'll be seeing pandemics of the century with great frequency if we don't get serious about not only national but global pandemic preparedness. If that happens, if the next pandemic of the century comes pretty rapidly, we are going to see enormous behavioral changes, no matter what guidelines are put in by governments. And that will have an especially major impact, again, in cities and their higher population densities, and in the opportunities and risks of moving to the smart city paradigm that I think most of us in this call, for sure, are very supportive of. So that's where I want to end it, Clint. I think we need to step back and look at these big issues of the possibility of major shift towards net zero and actions being taken towards social justice and towards pandemic response. These are all linked, and smart cities have to go forward, eyes open, in how to support the right directions in each of these 3 areas. Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary Moniz. That was really the most comprehensive discussion of decarbonization that I've heard since the last time that you spoke. And and thank you for really layering a hefty chunk of realism over some of the political aspirations and other aspirations that we've been hearing about. It's so refreshing to hear discussion of the need for coalitions when so many groups are polarized, to hear discussion of the need for supercharged innovation when R&D budgets have been cut and really should be enlarged. And the last 2 points that you made are of really critical interest to our think tank, so much so that, as Mike mentioned, we added 2 major pillars in the last few months: the pandemic and crisis response and infrastructure pillar, and the social equity, systemic racism, and human rights pillar. And you really emphasized in your talk a critical theme of our pandemic and crisis pillar, in that we are urging that crises not be considered an element of surprise anymore, that instead that we have infrastructure in place and that we expect crises to be part of the new norm now. Everything from not just pandemic, but cyber and turbulent weather and many other crises. We have to be much more prepared, and we're not. And thank you also, Mr. Secretary, for talking thoughtfully about social equity. We'll have some other discussion of that in our upcoming panel, and we'll also have a very careful discussion by Lisa Brown of building efficiency and other opportunities. But we're deeply grateful for your really extraordinary presentation today. Now I'm going to ask.
Thanks, Clint. But let me just make one final word, because I appreciate your raising so prominently the word coalitions. I just wanted to say that, and you mentioned the word polarizing, that when there are extreme statements made, including on unrealistic solutions, these are not harmless. They are not simply to be said, oh, well, that's, that's a statement, but fine. It's not harmless because it fractures coalitions. It prevents coalitions from being put together. So that's where much more pragmatism and coalition building really has to be the focus. Thanks for re-emphasizing that.
Truly so. Thank you, Ernie. We really appreciate your being here today. It was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Now my co-chair for our global energy sector and also for our Smart Cities think tank, Emma Hand, will introduce Melanie Kenderdine.
Thank you, everybody, and what a wonderful presentation by Dr. Moniz that was. It is now my pleasure to introduce to you all Melanie Kenderdine. She is, of course, well known in the energy sector, both in her current roles as a principal at EJM Associates with Dr. Moniz and as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, but also for her prior groundbreaking work at the DOE and the MIT Energy Initiative. Along with Dr. Moniz, she is one of the leading experts on the energy sector, particularly with respect to energy innovation, climate change, energy security, energy systems and infrastructure, and North American energy integration. Decision makers throughout the industry rely on her analyses and reports as they attempt to chart a path forward through an increasingly unpredictable world. And I know that you will all find her remarks just as intriguing and insightful as they do. Please join me in welcoming Melanie.
Thank you so much, Emma, and thanks to you and Clint and to Dentons for the invitation. I am, one would think I would be a pro at sharing my slides, but view is covered up, okay? Because I do this all the time, okay? And slideshow, there we go. So I'm going to use slides, obviously, and would like to start by saying I hope everyone is safe and healthy. No, these are very trying times, and I wish everyone the best. I would note that I've spoken at Denton Smart Cities conferences for a couple of years, and I wanted to take a little bit of a turn, moving from smart cities to smart communities, as well as the technologies that can support both. I have a special interest in rural America, and I'll say a little bit about that later on. I'm also going to talk about the urgent need for action on climate change and deep decarbonization. Secretary Moniz has talked about that. I'm going to talk about demand response and how it is enabled by smart technologies and how it can contribute to meeting this urgent need for deep decarbonization. And finally, I'll say a little bit about the range of participants in demand response programs. So first, I want to show you, this is from the IPCC. They put out a study last year that highlighted the need for a 1.5 degree target as opposed to a 2 degree target. Both of them addressed in the Paris Agreement, but the focus was on 2 degrees. 9 of 10 of the warmest years on record between 2005 2016. The Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the global average. Sea ice declining at a rate of 13% per decade. Sea levels have gone up 7 to 8 inches since 1900. That could reach 4 feet by 2100. This was kind of chilling. In May 2019, atmospheric CO2 emissions concentration reached 415 parts per million, the highest level in 800,000 years. Hard to get my head around 800,000, hard to get my head around 66 years. At the current rate of warming at 0.2 degrees per decade, the planet will reach the lower target of 1.5 years as early as 2030. According to the IPCC, and this on the right here are the differences between 1.5 and 2 degrees. On land, impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems, including species loss and extinction, those are projected to be lower at 1.5 degrees compared to 2. An increase of 2 degrees means that 37% of the world's population will experience extreme heat compared to 14% at 1.5. As of 2018, 2/3 of the major emitting countries were not on track to meet their targets. And in 2018, US CO2 emissions from fossil fuel combustion actually rose by 2.7%. These are key characteristics also from the IPCC report, key characteristics of a 1.5 degree pathway. And I'm only going to emphasize 2 of these. You can look at them at your leisure. First is greater mitigation efforts on the demand side, of course, and demand reductions in all end-use sectors beyond those for a 2 degree pathway. And the options are available to align 1.5 degrees with sustainable development. And over here on implementation, synergies are maximized, risks and trade-offs are limited or avoided through mitigation strategies. Lowering demand has many synergies and few trade-offs. This is from IEA, and it is 2 scenarios. The first is the BAU basically, and the second is their sustainable development scenario. And this is energy demand 2018-2040 in both. So this is BAU, coal goes up 17%, oil 25, natural gas 48, nuclear 32, renewables 97%, biomass down 12%. This is their sustainable development scenario. I won't bore you with the features of it, but it essentially gets us to 1.5 degrees or thereabouts by 2070. In that scenario, coal declines by 61%, oil by 32%, gas down a little bit, 3%, nuclear goes up 62%, but it's still only about, gas is still 2.5 times as much. Renewables up 215%. They outpace gas and everything basically in energy as an energy source. Again, solid biomass is in disfavor in this scenario. We need CO2 reductions at the gigaton scale. This is to give you a little perspective of what that means. In volume, it's 9 billion barrels of supercritical CO2. That's twice as much as US oil production in 2018. In weight, it's 12 times the amount of steel manufactured in the US in 2017. And in emissions, it's as much as the emissions from the entire US light duty fleet in 2017, 250 million vehicles. Okay, what this is the what's happened in CO2 emissions from 1990 to 2019. And the orange is the advanced economies and the gold is the rest of the world. What you can see here, advanced economies have actually declined. They've leveled off and then declined a little bit since 1990. CO2 emissions in the rest of the world have gone from 10 gigatons to 23 gigatons in 2019. According to, and you can see there, Paris Agreement, the emissions from the rest of the world have gone up by about 2 gigatons. According to the UN Environment Program, the emissions gap is large. In 2030, annual emissions need to be 15 gigatons lower than the current unconditional NDCs imply. So that's half of, at least half, this is 32 gigatons total, advanced economies and developed world, and 32 gigatons lower for the 1.5 degrees scenario. That says that by 2030, we have to get rid of almost all of the emissions you're seeing there, a challenge that nobody is making much progress on. these are a change in energy-related CO2 emissions by region. I mentioned 2017 in the U.S. they went up. Here in 2018 to 2019 they actually went down again. You can see EU, U.S., and Japan, they went down. Rest of the world way up. Here, let's skip that. Here are 2018 CO2 emissions and their global share. China, obviously number one there, 28%, US 15%. And this is the change since the Kyoto Protocol in '97. China's up almost 55%, US down 12%, India up 106%, Germany a little less than the US, but almost 12%. And then I looked at Saudi Arabia as kind of proxy for the for oil producers in the Middle East, and it's up 60%. These are US CO2 emissions relative to 1990. So 1990 is the base. What you can see there in the US, they peaked in 2007. 2009, that is the impacts on CO2 emissions of the Great Recession. I guarantee you'll see something like that because of COVID. Okay, they went up a little bit and then down again. And what you see there, and I hope he's still on the line, I attribute the steep decline from 2013 to 2017 to the Moniz administration. There are other reasons for that too. Over here, this is our CO2 emissions by type. Petroleum, number one, almost 45%. Gases displaced coal is number two, 29%. And coal there is at 26%. And then this is CO2 emissions by fossil fuel from fossil fuel combustion, 2017. Transportation leading the way. Electricity next at 35%, industry, and then buildings at only 11%. Secretary mentioned net zero. Many subnational entities in the United States are moving to net zero. What you see here, this needs updating. It's this figure is about a year old, but those are the entire states. In dark green, those are economy-wide neutrality. That's 3 states. The dark outline, statewide electricity carbon neutrality, 6 states. The blue circle outline, that's cities with economy-wide carbon neutrality. There are 7 of them. And the blue circle are cities with electricity sector carbon neutrality, 16 cities. They're not small cities. They include DC, Denver, Philadelphia, Chicago, etc. This is from IEA. They just released, this is from their World Energy Outlook. No, I'm sorry, it's from their innovation report. They just put it out. I mentioned the sustainable development scenario. What this says is that, oops, what it says is backwards. Well, forget it. What it says is that technologies at the mature and early adoption phases deliver almost 2/3 of the mid-century reductions under IEA sustainable development scenario. This strongly suggests a need to focus not only on innovation, that's clearly important, as noted by Secretary Moniz, but on incentives and strategies to rapidly deploy technologies that are mature or in the early stages of adoption. This includes a range of technologies that support what I'm going to say a little bit more about in demand response. What I've created here, this is for New England. I've given a couple of speeches in New England and we're doing a study. And I created a reference frame for those talks and for our study. And it's not intended, it's a reference frame, not intended to show the probable, just to provide reference points and context for decision making. And this is what actually got me focused on demand response. And what you have here are the installed capacity factors, okay, for gas, nuclear, and oil. And it's about 27,000 megawatts of installed capacity. And you're looking at their capacity factors. And the megawatts of capacity needed to replace this gas, oil, and nuclear capacity, and square miles of land needed. New England is very space constrained. So I was looking at what was needed what land use was needed for these various new technologies. So this is solar PV. That's the capacity factor there. And you would need to replace the 26,000 megawatts of gas, nuclear, and oil. You would need almost 60,000 megawatts of solar PV. If you replaced all of those natural gas, nuclear, and oil with solar, you would also need 57 square miles of land mass. The footnotes highlight the calculations. Those are from EIA. So lower capacity factors, you need 60,000 megawatts to compensate for that. You would also need storage. We'll go into that later. And 57 square miles for wind. 10 megawatts of onshore wind uses 44.7 acres. So you've got a higher capacity factor. You would need 42,000 megawatts to replace your oil, natural gas, and nuclear, but you would need 194 square miles. And then finally, here's offshore wind. Obviously, square miles are not important for offshore wind. So I only looked at how much capacity. That would be 33,000 megawatts of capacity, higher capacity factor, getting close to gas, nuclear, and oil in megawatts. But you would need 2,183 offshore wind turbines to do that. And so what I would say, this is, again, it's only a reference frame, but it underscores key issues in New England and I think in general about land use, infrastructure builds, lengthy permitting processes, both onshore and offshore. And New England rejected a transmission line from Quebec Hydro not long ago, and how difficult it is to build new infrastructure. And that took me, started me thinking about demand response, as did this. These are actual headlines from different parts of the country, different newspapers talking about opposition to siting transmission lines. The infrastructure siting opponents in these headlines don't care whether it's transmission for renewables or conventional energy. You can see some renewables are there, opposed there. In the Hamptons, that's a renewable transmission line in Wisconsin, et cetera, et cetera. So they don't care whether it's clean or conventional energy that's being transmitted. There's opposition to infrastructure builds. And it takes about 10 years plus in order to site and build a transmission line at a time when we urgently need action. And just to read this, as the presence of distributed generation EVs and other electrified loads in distribution grids increases, distribution network owners and operators will try to defer or avoid grid upgrades and reinforcements by using less traditional non-wire alternatives such as local demand side flexibility. So again, that takes us to demand response. Next, I wanted to show you some of the technologies and investments that are essential for both smart cities and communities, as well as for demand response. And what you see here, those are the numbers of utilities that were considering significant investments in 2019. In communities, communications optimization, 36 major utilities, advanced metering, 60, energy efficiency, 56, demand response, 50. What I would say about demand response here too is most of these other technologies are key enablers. Why it's its own category, there are other technologies that enable it. Meter data management, 50, analytics, 41, feeder automation, 40, GIS, 40, DER, 38, and voltage optimization, 37. I've also listed some key utilities that were considering investments in 2019. You can see them in bold. CPS Energy is up at the top. It's listed in 3 of 10 categories. So CPS Energy, you heard from Paula Gold-Williams yesterday. I heard her talk was great, and is deeply engaged in investing in these new technologies. But you also, and you see big IOUs, Con Ed, Dominion, VA, Virginia Power, San Diego Gas and Electric are on these lists. But also, in addition to CPS Energy, there's another large municipal utility, City Utilities of Springfield, that's down at the bottom. The Clay Electric Co-op in Florida, so proxy for other co-ops. Okay, rural electric co-ops is investing, and the Modesto Irrigation District in California. It provides, it's a private nonprofit that provides power and water services in California. So it shows the range of utility types, urban and rural, that are focused on these enabling technologies. I'm going to go through this very quickly. This is a virtual power plant. It's important because of the difficulties, in part because of the difficulties of siting large infrastructure. It makes a virtual power plant even more attractive. With a virtual power plant like the one depicted here, small isolated power generation can be used for load leveling. A virtual power plant, the power not used due to demand-based incentives could have the same value as power generated. And demand response eases pressure on the suppliers, saves electricity, and supports distributed renewable generation and community aggregators. Here, of special value to demand response are integrated control of distributed resources, and demand control technologies. It almost goes without saying here that this is about as smart as it gets. Why did it start over? Okay, having a problem. Don't know why. Here we go. Let's go here. Okay, I have no idea what happened. Something new happens every time on these video presentations. This is demand response incentives and services. It's in I'm sorry, the next slide's in California. It's a classification of demand response schemes, and I wanted to read the definition of demand response at this point. It's the active reduction, increase, shift, or modulation of energy and or demand on a limited time basis as compared to baseline consumption. Okay, and what you see here across this top are non-dispatchable services, products, and schemes. And that's largely from time-sensitive pricing. You have time of use, critical peak pricing, real-time pricing, et cetera. Down here, you have dispatchable demand response that enhances reliability through capacity, ancillary services, et cetera, et cetera. And what you have on the far right, direct load control, where utilities can remotely control some customers' appliances, et cetera, et cetera. That's primarily for the residential sector. And you have interruptible services. This is normally applied to large industrial consumers. And then down here on the bottom, you have economic dispatchable resources with various pricing schemes and demand bidding. Instead of being asked by utilities to take part in demand response programs, customers can make decisions by themselves in that scenario, in that service. This is from an LBNL study, a National Lab study, and that defined 4 key service types for demand response. And they are shape, shed, shift, and shimmy. Shape captures DR that shapes the underlying load profile. Shift represents demand response that encourages the movement of energy consumption from times of high demand to low demand. Shed describes loads that can occasionally be curtailed to provide peak capacity, et cetera, et cetera. And shimmy involves using loads to dynamically adjust demand on the system to alleviate short run ramps and disturbances at time scales ranging from seconds to an hour. And I'm sorry, I did these animations out of order and it's too hard to go back and fix it. So I'm going to start with shed. It covers time scales from days to seconds. Has 5 products in the California market, and that's the market. So you've got resource adequacy for peak capacity, economic demand response, Contingency reserve capacity has an ancillary services market, emergency DR, and I can't read the bottom one because my face is covering it on my screen. Okay, this is SHAPE, and SHAPE provides services for years to morning and evening, and it supplies capacity and time of use products. Here you go. SHIFT provides services from days to hours. It provides flexibility in ramping, helps enable variable renewables. And then finally, SHIMMY provides services from hours to seconds. And that also provides resource service, adequacy services and ramping products for variable renewables. Oops, sorry. I'm going to skip through this slide now. Let me show you what it says. This on the left is efficiency, which we've shifted to efficiency. On the right is demand response. These are energy savings, and efficiency just trumps, sorry, no pun intended, demand response for energy savings. That's demand response on the right. However, peak demand savings on efficiency, you can see the numbers there. Demand response far outpaces efficiency for peak demand savings. So it's worth it for that alone, and reduces the need for a lot of unused capacity, generation capacity that is just there for peaking. These are total peak demand savings by balancing authority. ERCOT's almost 4%. Southwest Power Pool and CalISO are a little over 2%. The rest of the Western Interconnect is a little over 2%. And you have MISO there right at 2%. And what I would note here is that single state markets seem to do the most here with demand savings at peak. Also note the very low numbers for New England. As I noted, this is an opportunity for New England to grow its demand response because of its space constraints, its infrastructure averse, and its supportive policies for renewables. And this is enrolled demand response programs in 2017 by program type. You can see there the blue is the dark blue mass market, light blue is commercial and industrial customers, and red is both. What you see here, air conditioners are hugely important. A lot of demand response from them, savings from them, and installed water heaters, not so much, thermostat adjustments, not so much, behavioral, not so much. Automation for your commercial and industrial customers provides a lot, as does customer initiated. Those are your industrial and commercial customers as well. Get love demand response, and they have a lot of capacity, 7.2 gigawatts. Total capacity is 18.3. Skip through this. Just two more slides. This is rural America and looking at demand response in rural America. What you see there, the gray areas are electric co-op areas, and the blue are electric co-op areas without broadband access. We're making a lot of progress on this. These numbers are for 2018, but in 2018, 24 million Americans lacked access to broadband. 80% of them are in rural communities. Broadband is essential for the demand response and other smart services that I talked about. But in spite of that, more than 60% of distribution co-ops offer at least one program to help their members save money with demand response by shifting electricity use to times when electricity costs are less to generate, buy, or deliver. So the rural co-ops are playing in this game. We need to give them more tools by providing them with universal broadband access. Finally, in closing, I'm going to circle back to the beginning, the need for urgent and sustained efforts to address climate change. These are figures from EIA's demand response report. And I note Mr. McNamara mentioned the global thought leaders are part of this effort. So I thought I would put in some international work. What you see here, the figure on the left is a picture of China's average hour electricity demand in the IEA Sustainable Development Scenario in 2040. On the right is it's without enhanced DR. And what you see on the without enhanced DR, and on the left is China with enhanced DR. So again, these are scenarios, sustainable development scenarios. And what you see here, you have unmet demand without enhanced DR. That's a little cross-hatched red, and you use a lot of storage. With enhanced DR, you see more solar, no unmet demand, no storage need, and less coal use. That's brown, the brown down at the bottom is coal use. So a lot of benefits in 2040 in China. What EIA concluded is that CO2 emissions from electricity supply could be reduced by 16% with demand response. And that number in the United States is 20, they also looked at the US, is 25%. With demand response in reducing CO2 emissions from the electricity sector. So it's hugely important for climate change too. And let me say in closing, I hesitated to focus on demand response. Like efficiency, it is decidedly unsexy. I hope today I have succeeded in making it at least mildly interesting. More importantly, I hope I have conveyed its importance to a clean energy future. It's an enabler of renewables, can save energy and lower costs, and reduce CO2 emissions. We need to take full advantage of demand response for smart cities and smart communities to meet our climate goals by mid-century. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Melanie. You know, you have provided one of the more compelling presentations and series of analyses that I've seen on issues that are not talked about enough and are underfunded. No one discusses conservation anymore, which is a huge issue, and the benefits of efficiency and demand response as two really critical tools in the toolbox. And Melanie, special thanks to you and to Secretary Moniz for your really thoughtful, compelling presentations. This is our groundbreaking developments panel for our Smart Cities and Connected Communities think tank. Our internal team has called this the Cool Kids panel because each of your presenters are doing incredibly exceptional and timely things with kind of breaking news stories. So we're just going to shift the order a little bit. I'm going to start with Morgan O'Brien, who is the executive chairman and co-founder of Anterix. On May 13th, Anterix received a landmark green light from the Federal Communications Commission to provide exclusive 900 megahertz LTE spectrum networks to the utility industry and beyond, to critical infrastructure. Morgan is the legendary co-founder and chairman of Nextel, the visionary who created the first all-digital nationwide wireless network. And in case you think that I'm speaking in hyperbole, here are a few of the awards that Morgan has received. And I know I'm embarrassing him. Person of the Year, Entrepreneur of the Year, member of the Washington, D.C. Business Hall of Fame, and recognition as, quote, one of the top wireless innovators of all time. Morgan is the perfect person to speak to us about the confluence of spectrum and critical infrastructure, including networks for the utility industry. Morgan, if you can please describe Anterix for a moment. Tell us about the FCC decision in May and what your vision is for the utility industry.
Thanks, Clint, and hello, everybody. And I'm so happy to be here, and particularly glad as a geek to be described as one of the cool kids. I assume all the rest of the panelists generally are cool, but I was definitely from the geek background. So let's talk about the very good news, what the FCC did after almost a 6-year process. And what they did is they listened to opportunity, and they encouraged innovation, and it has a direct application to smart cities, and in particular to critical infrastructure, and in particular the electric utility industry. And what the FCC did is they said, okay, we're going to change 35-year-old rules, and we're going to permit very precious spectrum, which is in a sort of an excellent combination of propagation and penetration. It's a nationwide spectrum position. We're going to let that spectrum be made available for new broadband services. And the kind of services that are anticipated are those that can be provided through LTE, which is the first ever global wireless technology. And every one of us I know, whether geek or cool, has at least one device in their pocket or their purse, which runs on LTE. Now, this spectrum has been made available so that private industrial use of LTE can be deployed. And what the position that Anterix fills in this is we're very much hoping to help drive innovation in the industry. We have a very large spectrum position in this band that we acquired back 6 years ago. But we're a player, but not the only player in this space, attempting to find a perfect way to marry up LTE broadband technology and the demands of the modernizing grid. So let's talk about a few things that can be done with the right deployment of LTE broadband technology for critical infrastructure, and applies directly to smart cities and the topics today. This technology, when deployed in a private infrastructure, can be insulated from the internet. It can be far more cyber secure than anything that relies on interconnection through the internet. It has the capacity, it has the capability to support numerous cases that make the grid operate more efficiently and with more resiliency. And the example I like to use is that, as everybody on this panel knows, what's happening to the grid is that it's being driven by distributed generation, such as wind and solar, under the impetus to use less carbon fuel. And as that happens, as the distributed generation becomes an integral part of the modernizing electric grid, two-way communications is essential in a way that it's never been required before. So let me stop by saying a very exciting opportunity, and Anterix is thrilled to be a player in this space. We've gotten to know many of the movers and shakers in the electric utility industry, and we're working with them, trying to bring all the benefits of modern technology, of broadband technology, into solving critical problems that are facing the electric industry in grid modernization. So let me stop there, Clint, and you can direct me someplace else if you'd like.
Morgan, what would be some example of use cases for Anterix, from wildfires to cyber?
Sure.
Can you elaborate?
Sure, absolutely. Let me give you some examples. I had the opportunity to participate on a panel yesterday for NARC, the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, and spoke about some of these use cases. And in particular, I focused on the last mile in connectivity for getting control of and having a situational awareness of what's happening during every part of the grid. And this is these are the sensors that can be deployed throughout the grid, way beyond the reach of fiber and into the hard to reach places where wireless is the perfect way of collecting data and analyzing it, and then having situational awareness. So there are numerous use cases for monitoring and controlling critical elements of grid operation through a far-flung area. So that's one category of use. Another category of use is for wildfires. We think this is such a vivid illustration. There's a technology called falling line conductor, and it takes roughly 1.4 seconds for a wire that's been struck, say, by a branch in a windstorm. It takes roughly 1.4 seconds for that live wire to hit the ground. And if there's dry brush there, that live wire can and often does start a wildfire. The technology, the LTE technology, because it has amazing capabilities of speed, which is referred to as latency, that technology can measure, detect the fault, send a notice back to headquarters, and get them notice back to deactivate that line within the 1.4 seconds, because LTE technology operates in milliseconds. This is way beyond the capability of existing wireless technologies, and it's just one of the great benefits that the FCC has now made available for private LTE uses. And there are numerous others. There's dozens of use cases that have developed from typically not mobility, which most of us think of when we think wireless, but fixed wireless uses.
Can you imagine if PG&E had used this, had acquired this network and used this technology? Of course, it couldn't before the FCC approved it, but think of all the lives and physical damage that could have been saved.
Let's look at it this way. There's a convergence now of technology which is driven by the insatiable appetite of consumers around the world has driven volumes into the billions of the chipsets that operate on LTE. And as a result of those billions of chipsets, the cost has driven down. And so it is now economically practical to do things with these chips and devices and control elements that would never have been possible before. So it's a convergence of that, the regulatory environment, any number of other things. It's tragic to think of what could have been, but it's for our purposes, we're trying now to move forward, learn everything we can about what's going on in grid modernization, because there's many different things going on in grid modernization, to see to the extent to which broadband wireless can become a important foundational element of the new grid.
Two of the really critical things for smart city and connected community development are the modernization of the grid and moving from a single directional grid to multi-directional, as you've discussed, protection against cybersecurity, and advanced telecommunications. And you really come in a very important niche. I think the importance of this discussion is the utility industry really does not yet fully understand the potential here. I think they've begun to understand it. The Edison Electric Institute's done a very superb job of communicating this opportunity. But can you just give us 60 seconds on where you would like to see the industry a year from now as we come back and discuss this topic?
Sure. Let me start by saying, when I first started to get up to speed in electric utility industry and what the challenges it's facing, one of the things that grabbed me was the description of the U.S. electric grid as the most complex machine ever devised by man. So I have a lot of humility when approaching the electric utility industry about how and what we can do to address some of their needs. So at this point, we're in a familiarization. The FCC has only acted May 15th, as you indicated. So we're doing everything we can to get familiarization of the opportunity and to try to see the extent to which perhaps collectively, because there is a tremendous networking effect. If it's great if a single utility deploys this new technology, but it's greater if 2 and 4 and 8 adopt it, because there's tremendous economies of scale and the ability for the industry to overcome a lot of the problems that you have if you try to operate a highly complex technology like this in isolation. So I would say our vision is the industry becomes familiar with, and gets comfortable with, gets its regulators comfortable with the kinds of investment that need to be made. And then the networks begins to take over and produce all sorts of benefits.
Thank you, Morgan. Really appreciate your being here with us today. I know you've got some very tight time constraints and may not be able to stay for the full panel, but we really appreciate you being here.
Happy. I'm interested to hear what everybody else has to say.
Great. Well, Justin Driscoll is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel for the New York Power Authority. He is a member of NYPA's Executive Committee, and he provides legal and policy advice to their chairman, trustees, CEO, and senior leadership. Justin's CEO, Gil Quinones, told me at one point that Justin was the best CEO that he's ever worked with. And he is beloved at the New York Power Authority. Justin serves on the board of the New York City's Urban Green Council and the World Resources Institute's Global Energy Advisory Board, which is a board that's near and dear to my heart. Justin, New York Power Authority has been leading in so many ways. You are famous for creating the first end-to-end virtual utility, or working on the development of that. You have been doing a lot of work with the communities in developing smart city approaches in New York. And you've also been really in the hot spot for the pandemic in New York through no fault of your own, just a result of your geography and proximity to New York City. And yet you have been a model for the rest of the country in many of the things you've done. If you could describe a little bit about the technology that you're deploying with New York Power Authority, and maybe discuss things you're doing with communities.
Great. Thank you, Clint. Thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be on this panel today. Much appreciated. I enjoy these discussions. It's such a great group to be with, so thank you. I wanted to talk about two things today. One, some work we're doing in the smart city space around smart city street lighting, and then maybe spend a few minutes talking about our enterprise-wide digital utility, end-to-end digital utility strategy. So maybe just a second on the New York Power Authority. So the first slide is a map of the of the state and show some of our assets around the state. So we're the largest state-owned utility in the country, and we have about 6,500 megawatts of generation, and also on about a third of the high voltage transmission systems, about 1,400 miles of transmission. We've got a clean fleet of assets. 83% of our generation is renewable, and we really, as you can see from the maps, serve as the sort of the backbone of the transmission system, both east, west, and north, south. And we own most of the interties to PJM in Western New York, and to Ontario Power Gen, Hydro-Quebec, and the New England power system. So a lot of activity in all different directions in terms of our transmission system. Our customers are primarily governmental customers, state agencies, cities, towns, villages. We have munis and co-ops as well. And we do serve a small slice of the private sector in connection with some economic development customers that we have that are primarily required by our statutory mandate, and also sometimes as a result of our hydropower licenses. And for those customers, we also do about $250 million to $300 million of energy efficiency projects for those customers. So one program that we rolled out in the smart city space was commenced in 2018, and it's called Smart Street Lighting New York, which was launched by the governor with a goal of converting 500,000 streetlights to LED by 2025, and he directed the New York Power Authority to lead that effort. So as most of the folks know on this panel and in this audience, increasingly street lighting systems are no longer used solely to illuminate roadways, but are now considered vertical assets that can be used for a variety of new and innovative functions. And through the Smart Street Lighting New York program, NYPA assists municipalities around the state to convert the lights to LED, and then offers the option of adding smart city platforms for the deployment of additional technologies along with those LED lights. We offer a full turnkey service, including financing, the purchasing of the poles by the municipality from the local utility, and then we'll install, and then we'll help them maintain the lights. And they can add on, as many bells and whistles as they want. They can maybe start just with lights, or they can start with a small subset of the technologies that we can deploy, or some communities adopt the full smart city package. So far we've got about 350,000 lights in development, design, or construction around the state. So we're already at about 65% of our 2025 goal. And as I said, these fixtures create a smart city platform that results in improved municipal services and a better quality of life for the residents of these communities. And another feature of the program is we launched a $7.5 million grant program that enables these municipalities to essentially buy down the cost of the smart city add-on technologies. And so we've helped some communities add to the package that they've purchased from us. And one great example is Syracuse, New York, where we provided a grant of $500,000 toward the purchase of 17,500 lights and poles. And they used that money to upgrade to the smart city platform. And the mayor there was quoted as saying that he wanted to be a leader in this area, and he hoped that by deploying these technologies and being forward thinking that he might be able to attract more residents and businesses to his city. So just very quickly, a few things that these technologies add to the smart city environment. You have asset management capabilities, and by that I mean full controllability of all the lines. You get performance notifications. You have dimming features. On the public safety side, you can have video streaming, license plate reading, noise monitoring, gunshot detection. And then on the connectivity side, you hope that maybe these smart city technologies reduce the digital divide in some neighborhoods, and also potentially enable public Wi-Fi and maybe the future deployment of other IoT devices and 5G. On the environmental side, air quality, ice and snow detection, weather reporting, flood warning, thermal mapping, and waste management advice and notices. So all in all, very exciting, I think, program in a small way that we can play in the smart city space, given our limited customer base and the uniqueness of our assets. So next, I'd like to just spend a couple minutes talking about, and we could go to the next slide, please. Spend a couple minutes talking about our digital journey. As many of you know, a couple years ago, our CEO planted a flag and said that we want to become the first end-to-end digital utility. And so most of us around the organization asked, what does that mean? And so we worked on developing a definition internally, and you can imagine, just like vision statements and other things that we worked on in this space. It took quite a while for everybody to agree on a single definition. So the definition is that NYPA will become an end-to-end digital utility leveraging connectivity, big data, and analytics to drive actionable business insight that enables us to better serve our customers, employees, and other key stakeholders. So as part of this effort, there are really three main pillars to it. One is our Integrated Smart Operations Center, or ISOC, and you'll see that depicted on the slide. And this basically is a data collection effort where we deploy sensors throughout the state. We transmit information through our communications backbone, some of what Morgan was talking about, secure way for us to transmit data from all the sensors we've deployed. And then the ISO 55000 is just a certification that we've met a certain standard. Very popular in Europe, not so much in North America, but we were the first North American utility to receive an ISO 55001 certification. So basically, this is the asset performance piece of it through the ISOC, and what you get is basically across the bottom: outage avoidance, improved reliability, and long-term planning, enablement. So the next pillar of the digital strategy is what we call the Agile, or our Advanced Grid Innovation Lab for Energy. And there, again, touching on something Morgan said there, we're really looking to use big data analytics to simulate and integrate the next generation electric grid so that we can plug in, let's say, a new wind farm or a new solar farm, or model out a big injection of offshore wind into the grid, perhaps on Long Island, and see what that does to the system. And we make that available to other utilities and people in the private sector that want to utilize that database. And the third pillar is what we call the New York Energy Manager, or NIAM, which is another data collection exercise for our government buildings that we have. Since we have so many governmental customers with considerable amount of buildings, as you can imagine, a state university of New York with close to 60 campuses around the state and all the buildings that they have. And so what we've done is we've done deep sub-metering and created a database through deployment of sensors throughout 18,000 governmental buildings around the state. And what we do is we feed that into the ISOC here and help customers monitor their energy use. We can also help them spot emerging repair issues and so forth. So the idea behind this is essentially you're creating digital twins of your assets and inserting them into the ISOC, and then the system knows what healthy looks like, and then you feed in real-time data from either the transmission system or power plants or substations or transmission lines, and we know what healthy looks like. So if we see any abnormalities, we can address them. And just in the first year, we saved over $5 million in fewer outages and spotting maintenance before it became an issue. So right now we have 55,000 sensors deployed throughout our system, and our plan currently is to go to 115,000 sensors around the state, and gather that data, send it back to our ISOC, which is located in our main office in White Plains, and be able to, like I said, monitor that data inflow and help us better preserve our assets and better serve our customers and our stakeholders. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Justin. Secretary, the honor of visiting you and Gil Quinones and visiting the Integrated Smart Operations Center. It looked a little bit to us like the deck of the Starship Enterprise, except possibly it was more sophisticated. And it's really been exciting to watch how much you've developed even in the time since we were able to visit the Operations Center. Where do you see yourself a year from now in terms of the projects that you've just described?
Well, I think just like we were discussing, we'll have a lot more data a year from now. Hopefully, we'll know what to do with it all, and we'll be able to make informed decisions based on that data. Key element is obviously protecting it too, with all the issues surrounding cybersecurity and our customers' databases and their desire sometimes for privacy around those two. So I think we'll continue to develop better platforms to analyze the data, maybe be able to make even more long-range decisions and planning based upon the initial data we received. As we move towards some of the aggressive clean energy goals that our governor has outlined that are now part of state law, we're going to need to continue to be focusing on the impact on the grid of all of the new sources of generation and the retirements of existing generation, and just how that's all going to come together. So I see that as a major focus that where NYPA can really play a leading role going forward through our Agile Lab.
We were really impressed at your ability by creating the virtual twins on your system and also with your customers' major facilities, at your ability to just anticipate when a piece of equipment might be end of use, or if there was a failure that was just in the beginning stages. Do you want to make one last comment about that, and then we'll move on to our next panelist?
Well, we're utilizing a lot of machine learning and closely examining the information that we're getting real time from our assets, and so they can see just minor deviations in the normal operation of an asset that could just cause you to maybe take a close look at it, where you wouldn't otherwise maybe be paying a visit to that piece of equipment through routine maintenance for another month. Maybe it causes you to take an earlier look and you spot something that the system has identified, and like I said, avoid either more maintenance costs or potentially even avoid an unplanned outage.
I really hope that your technology and your approach begins to be emulated more by some of the other utilities in the United States and globally. I think it will help a tremendous amount. And it's very exciting to see how you've developed from a kind of an aspirational idea to really a realistic and highly effective program. So thank you, Justin, as always, for being with us.
Thank you, Clint.
Our next speaker is Lisa Brown. Lisa is the National Director for Municipal Infrastructure and Smart Communities for Johnson Controls. She created Johnson Controls' Local Government Urban Efficiency Initiative, and Lisa is a member of the Women of Municipal Government Committee for the National League of Cities and the Smart Cities Communities Advisory Board for the International City Managers Association. Lisa has served as a global ambassador for International Women's Day and received the New York Women of Valor Humanitarian Award for her incredible work outside of her profession, helping advance her community and civil society. You heard Melanie Kenderdine and also Secretary Moniz talk about the tremendous importance of greater efficiency with buildings and the disproportionate percentage that buildings contribute to carbon emissions. So that's the world Lisa lives in with Johnson Controls. Lisa, can you tell us a little bit about the groundbreaking work that Johnson Controls is doing, and also tell us why words like secure, connected, and resilience are such an essential part of your vocabulary and your vision for smart cities and connected communities.
Thank you, Clint. Thank you for saying those three words. They're like, I sprinkle them out constantly in the universe. I love to hear when they come back. So good afternoon, everyone. The question that we're asked by city leaders all the time is how we, as my Johnson Controls, can help them with their recovery and their reoccupancy and their phased reopening of their buildings, their places and their spaces. And not just theories at this point. Thought leadership must include providing actionable information, which has evolved in the last several months. And while the world is united in this shared experience, it really significantly varies globally between regions and states and local municipalities. Our leaders, especially leaders that we've been working with, have asked, how do we reopen our buildings? How do we keep them safe and secure? How do they reduce their costs and be more efficient? And then how to really bring back flexibility and resiliency. One thing they certainly have learned is how to be adaptive, and they know their infrastructure needs to be as well. So cities and counties and municipal entities are really looking for those right partners and advisors, such as yourselves, at this critical time of recovery. And communities really need to create flexible and safe building environments that will guide their citizens and constituents and business owners into that new safe new world. We're not really using new normal, new world return, right, as the phase reopening of all these local economies that have been greatly impacted during the pandemic. Citizen cooperation and leadership alignment throughout the world is also very key. And we're seeing that unravel in the news, and specifically with some of our customers. Just getting that citizen cooperation is vital. So directly in line with that cooperation is really that citizen confidence that we've all been discussing, and really the ability to have a nearly touchless experience when they enter buildings, have the technology to ensure the safe distancing, contact tracing, air purification, and disinfecting technologies, and creating those flexible infrastructure in places and spaces that can bring those people out of their shelters and have them thrive again. So cities really need partners. They're asking for partners that can help them create and fund that sustainable infrastructure. They know that in the past, they were not investing in technologies that allowed for them to seamlessly connect with their people and their staff and their buildings. And now we're really kind of reaping, I guess, the consequences. So I've been fortunate to be with Johnson Controls. We've been on the forefront of building, as Clint mentioned, some really vital patient monitoring environments, converting spaces such as old cotton mills, parking lots, convention centers into hospitals, and helping municipal buildings such as city halls and police and fire complexes being more adaptive, so they can easily be put to work in natural disasters and future health crises. So we have mentioned that while our future is uncertain, one thing is really clear, that local government and community leaders are embracing more innovation, and they're really determined to make their cities and their community environments more secure, connected, and resilient. And prior to COVID and this pandemic, we spoke about clear, connected, and resilient communities, and that message remains. The collective experience that this pandemic has brought and assisting cities across the globe to get back to really thriving has been extraordinary. And the people and the individuals like yourselves on this webinar who are really focusing on innovation and creativity and prosperity and resiliency are the true champions and for supporting sustainable communities and the planet. And we've just been incredibly humbled by the work that our partners have asked us to do, our customers, and how we've been just supporting coming out through this economic thaw into current day. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit about touchless buildings, things that you've just innovated since the pandemic has struck?
Right. So that's what we've been hearing is, and we put together basically a checklist. We were hearing in the air, on surfaces, and I guess surfaces, air, and out the door, what that means to be touchless, what that means for individuals to feel safer to get back into those buildings. And so from remote monitoring, from using, as Justin mentioned, lighting technologies and the vertical assets to help with contact tracing, air purification, social distancing and spacing, remote access, helping flow of individuals and heat mapping of patients as well as citizens and business owners. It's been very interesting that we're trying to create these nearly touchless environments because their citizens are saying they won't come into their buildings, they won't come back out to their restaurants. Even if there's phased reopenings, they need that confidence in knowing that they're safe and that their city leaders and their and leaders in the building community and business community have their safety in mind. So we've been working with a lot of the technologies that we've had in the past. We've been partnering with some extraordinary companies, such as the New York Power Authority is one of our good partners, to put together these touchless, frictionless, safe, resilient environments. And it's been intense and really rewarding. So.
Wow, I can't wait to see those developments that are essential.
Yeah.
What, to close out, what would be one or two examples of really innovative developments with smart buildings in terms of decarbonization?
Yeah, decarbonization, absolutely. So when we look at that, and I will say from an innovative, I'll just say a pandemic innovative building, I'll use that example. We're assisting a city out on the West Coast in building a navigation center or a homeless center, very different than what they've had before. It was converted from an old factory to make it safe and to ensure that the folks that they're trying to keep in a safer spot are coming into a safer space. They're allowed to bring partners, they're allowed to bring their pets, which is not normally the case. And they needed to stand that up in a month. And so working with their local contractors and their engineers, working with all the different parts of city government, which as we know is continues to be siloed, to try to pull this all together to help them from an efficiency standpoint, from a safety standpoint, and then an overall resiliency, because this is going to be a permanent structure that they were rebuilding, putting isolation wards in this space to make sure that if folks did become positive, that there would be a safe place for them to be. Every single experience, I think Clint has, is the positive and negative, is that they're unique. And we're being asked to do things that it's not perhaps scalable in the future, but right now they're so customized depending on what the previous infrastructure was, but we always have an eye on how can we make it more efficient, how can we make it more resilient. We certainly have our eye laser focused on decarbonization and ensuring that whatever that we are standing up now will meet the standards for the future. And we have groups within our organization, like, our government relations and sustainability councils, that they make sure that everything that we do has that element included in it.
Thank you, Lisa. I love hearing messaging from Johnson Controls. You're so far in the forefront on these critical issues. And please give my best to my dear friends, your colleagues, Katie McGinty and Clay Nessler.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Greg Katz. And Greg is the founder and CEO of the Smart Surfaces Coalition and the president of Capital E. Greg currently chairs the congressionally established advisory board to environmentally update 430,000 federal buildings. Greg has received the Lifetime Achievement Award from the Alliance to Save Energy, which is a organization that's very close to Emma Hand and my heart. Emma serves as their pro bono outside general counsel, and I have served on their executive committee of their board for many years. And what a great person to select, as you'll hear in a moment. Greg also was the first recipient of the U.S. Green Building Council's Lifetime Achievement Award. We have not really ever discussed smart surfaces in the context of smart cities. And I've been fascinated as Greg has taught me more and more about this subject by the extraordinary work that he's doing, the importance of it, not just in a decarbonization context, but in the context of the latest pillar of our think tank, which covers social equity, systemic racism, and more globally, human rights. So I'm really excited to hear from Greg today. And Greg, can you tell us basically what the Smart Surfaces Coalition is and what your mission is? We'll need to unmute you, Greg. Are you able to unmute yourself? There we go.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, perfect.
So thank you for being gracious as always. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So thanks again, Clint, for having us be part of this. Let me answer your question indirectly. We know that cities are on average 9 degrees hotter in the summer. And we know that low-income neighborhoods are 15 degrees hotter in the summer. And that has huge health and energy consumption and climate impact consequences. The way that cities have made selections around how they surface their cities has been on an agency by agency basis. So when you talk to a Department of Transportation and you say, hey, what about making that dark road more reflective or porous? They'll say, well, why would you do that? And you say, well, because you want to reduce city temperature and smog and you want less flooding. And that's a big deal in a climate change world. And they say, well, that's not our responsibility or expertise. So the creation of the coalition was to take a step back and say to cities, you should think about all your surfaces together. This is how you manage sun and rain. And the way we do it today is lowest first cost, dark, impervious surfaces that cause enormous amount of heat and flooding. And cities where most of us live, as a result, are, again, 9 degrees hotter, 15 if you're in low-income neighborhoods. The coalition is made up of 40 organizations, including the National League of Cities, the largest city group, the American Public Health Association, the American Institute of Architects, the American Planning Association. So organizations that are very influential at the city level. And we're thrilled and absolutely delighted and very grateful that Clinton, his partner Simon Steele, are serving as pro bono counsel to Smart Surfaces in our work in the US and internationally. Over the last decade of research, we found that cities that adopt smart surfaces across the city typically achieve benefits that are between 3 and 5 times as large as the cost. And those benefits accrue in areas like large reductions in AC peak load, improved air quality, reduced health costs, increased employment, reduced risk of credit rating downgrade from a Moody's or Standard and Poor. And so the purpose of this coalition, this relatively new not-for-profit, is initially in the US, India, and Southern Europe to work with and enable cities to shift from what they do today, which is to make surface decisions at the level of an agency on a lowest first cost basis, and instead to take a step back and say, hey, let's do what's most cost effective. Let's think about all of these surfaces in totality. And in doing so, we can change the trajectory of temperature in our city. So adopting smart surfaces can deliver about 2 degrees Fahrenheit peak reduction in the summer every decade for the next 3 decades, and can deliver about a 10 to 15% greenhouse gas reduction equivalent. So it's both climate change mitigation and a lot of climate change adaptation, which is the temperature reduction. As I noted, the benefits disproportionately accrue in low-income areas, which are minority areas. And then we actually have a study coming out with the American Public Health Association documenting the benefits in terms of pandemic risk reduction from smart surfaces. So it's a new coalition, ambitious agenda, reshaping how cities think about and quantify their surfaces. We built a cost benefit analytic engine we worked with about 25 cities on already. And so that's what we're trying to do, reshape city surfaces in order to improve quality of life, cut costs, slow climate change, and continue to have cities livable. Imagine, my last point here is, imagine as a mayor saying, we are adopting strategies that will reduce the city temperature 2 degrees every decade. So the world is getting hotter, the country's getting hotter, your city, your homes are getting cooler. That's a good story.
Greg, what are your biggest challenges right now? Is it jurisdictional turf, or is it funding, or all of the above?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the biggest challenge is inertia. So if you talk to a Department of Transportation or the department that deals with water, they say, well, we've done this for 100 years. Why should we do it differently? And by the way, when I go and communicate what we're doing to the CFO or the mayor, I'm not getting any feedback saying that my budget's changing or my priorities are changing. So what has to happen is the city has to step back and say, wait a minute, for the first time, let's think about our entire surfaces, which are around 2/3 hard surfaces, and adopt surfaces through strategies that for cities can cost no money. So code, flexibility on FAR, flexibility on accelerated permitting are tools that cities have that at no cost to them that can provide a compelling incentive for the private sector to reframe their surfaces and make the cities much more reflective, much more porous, use more solar, use more green.
You know, yesterday our global chairman, Joe Andrew, challenged us to find fulcrums for change and have a much greater sense of urgency. And Secretary Moniz this morning, if you were able to hear him, talked about supercharged innovation. Your concept, your concerns, and your coalition are focused on issues that could make a huge difference right now. And so we want to really do our best to amplify your message. I know that Jennifer Morrissey and Rudy Beasy, the co-editors in chief of our editorial board, have put out a major publication for us all, and we'll make sure that everyone associated with Think Tank and with these panels receives that. And we're very interested in your thought leadership here, Greg, and we are also going to be disseminating a video that you created as part of this discussion. But I really tip my hat to you. If you had, what is your goal for the next 12 months? What do you need to do to seriously advance your cause on an urgent basis?
Thank you, Clint. We're in discussion with 4 multilateral development banks, and we hope to be doing the first pilot with one of them later this fall. We're raising about $50 million, a very small portion of which goes to this NGO. The vast majority goes to 25 partners, some of which I named, but includes like Terry in India and Grand Bank and others, to really accelerate adoption about tenfold of smart surfaces, because we've got a lock-in situation where we've got tens of trillions of dollars of infrastructure investment in the next decades in expanding urban areas. If those are built as status quo, it could add up to a degree of C in warming. But if you adopt high albedo, porous, green, and PV, you could actually reduce warming because you're bouncing much more light and heat back into space. You're increasing power generation. We have an MOU with NREL, a National Renewable Energy Lab, to look at quantifying the additional benefits of putting PV on green roofs and high albedo roofs. So what we have not done is understood the full benefits at all. That's part of the coalition's purpose. We've put a big price tag on making anything different from dark impervious surfaces. And so, Clint, your support in recognizing this, your leadership in bringing together leaders like my colleagues on this call is incredibly important to say we don't have to do what we've done in the past going forward. We can do it better, smarter, save money, save lives, build jobs, build communities, and that's really our purpose.
Greg, thank you so much for being with us today, and we look forward to having you with us frequently in the future. A really exciting and important message.
Thank you so much.
Our next panelist is my good friend and colleague, Chantal Bernier, who leads Dentons' Canadian privacy and cybersecurity practice. Chantal has been teaching me a lot about privacy and data sharing, and of course, privacy in Canada is a human right. Chantal is fluent in 4 languages, and she advises leading national and international companies as they expand into Canada and Europe and the United States. Chantal spent a number of years at the helm of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner of Canada. Her rich experience in this field has included privacy analysis of Google's Sidewalk Labs proposal on behalf of Waterfront Toronto, with Chantal representing the government side of that. And Chantal, you were the lead attorney relating to privacy with respect to Waterfront Toronto, also known as the Quayside project involving Google's Sidewalk Labs. There was a tremendous amount of excitement, but also controversy related to Google's approach. Can you discuss that project a little bit? Tell us about the lessons that have been learned. Google has since withdrawn its project because in part of substantial public concern. So let me let you explain what happened and what advice you have for all of us going forward. And Chantal, you'll need to unmute. Great.
I thought I had unmuted. Thank you, Clint. And thank you for inviting me to join such an interesting panel. Really, I thought that listening to Morgan and Justin and Lisa and Greg brings to the fore the potential of technology to improve municipal services and municipal outcomes. And that indeed was the plan in the Quayside project. Now, technology, for example, let's take the greening technology that Greg described. does not necessarily rest upon personal information. So the issues of permeability of the soil or addressing heat islands does not engage any personal information and therefore does not engage privacy rights. But as Justin mentioned in relation to utilities, and Justin, you gave the example of smart streetlights, many digital innovations do rest upon use of personal information. And that is precisely where, as you mentioned, Clint, the Quayside project became so contentious. And the main lesson to draw is the fact that addressing privacy issues is key to obtaining social license to implement the digital innovations that a smart city will rely upon. And so what I did, Clint, is that I went through all of the privacy comments, analyses that have been put forward in relation to smart city innovations. And I decided to draw the four main ones, the ones that come most prominently. So most prominent, and we saw it in spades in the Quayside project, is the fear of surveillance. And so going back, for example, Justin gave us a really interesting description of the potential of smart streetlights. But at this moment, San Diego is dealing with a very controversial issue whereby there are media reports that the police used the footage of the smart streetlights to conduct criminal investigations on protesters, including the defunding the police protests. So the fear of surveillance is a very, very important privacy risk to address. And there are solutions, but right now I would just like to bring out all the risks. A second risk, a fear that comes out a lot, is fear of surveillance by the private sector agents who are hired, who are engaged, who provide technology to the smart city. And one example of that is what happened in London with the smart bins. So 2012, London Olympics, London decides to install smart garbage bins that had the capacity to push notifications on every cell phone in their vicinity to alert them of a security threat. So it was a security purpose. Fast forward to 2013, and we discover that the company who had provided the smart bins was now pushing ads to the cell phones in the vicinity of the smart bins. Complete departure from the initial purpose and no consent. So that's an example of how privacy risks are well-founded. A third that really comes up a lot is the fear of data breach. And that, in fact, from my literature review, I have seen that cybersecurity experts are also concerned about cyber attacks against municipalities. It's not just citizens. Cybersecurity experts invoke the fact that, sadly, municipalities do not always have the proper funding to protect the data at the level that they should. On top of that, cities are hot targets because the data they have is so useful in terms of ID theft. Plus, because it's critical data, ransomware, which essentially paralyzes your database, is, of course, of a great promise, let's say, to ransomware attackers. So those are the really four main issues that came out in the controversy, as you say, Clint, around Quayside, and that appear in every smart city project that I have studied as trying to put the Quayside project in perspective.
We have, just to really support what you've just said, Chantal. Every city and community that Dentons represents, on everything from grid modernization to telecommunications, advanced street lighting, every city has encountered exactly the same concerns. And I think one of your invaluable pieces of guidance to us has been to really address these issues on the front end. And there are protections that can be given. I know in New Orleans, there was really concern when the administration and the local utility was going forward with some surveillance technology, some street lighting technology that had a crime surveillance element to it. And the city ended up suspending their approach until they could develop a privacy and data sharing resolution that the major stakeholders agreed to, or at least compromised on going forward. We have seen ransomware issues now increasing for cities. It can be very devastating for city government. We've seen some shut down for 7 and 8 weeks, and still struggling to come back. What advice do you have for mayors and city council leaders and county commissioners with respect to these topics? How are you solving them?
So overall, the advice or the lesson I've learned in these pretty intense years we've just gone through with Quayside. So the first piece of advice is understand that without privacy protection, you do not have social license, and you will run into issues. You gave the example of New Orleans. I gave the example of San Diego. But we can take those examples over Europe as well. So that's the first overall advice, is address privacy, as Justice mentioned, as integral to the rolling out, the integration of digital innovations in a smart city. Going back then to the specific solutions you can adopt to address the specific risks I've mentioned. So the first one, fear of surveillance. Well, first of all, there are privacy impact assessments, which are pre-adoption of a digital innovation, looking at how does it balance collection of personal information versus the public interest that is met. Is it proportionate? Is it necessary? And therefore ground the digital innovation in a legitimacy basis. Then be accountable. And here I will use the example of Metrolinx in Toronto. Metrolinx is the public transportation, introduced chip cards, big concerns that the police could access the chip card's data and therefore a person's itinerary for surveillance. So Metrolinx adopted public guidelines on how they would accept or refuse to provide access to law enforcement to personal data. And every year, Metrolinx publishes the figures. How many requests did they get from law enforcement to access personal data? How many did they refuse? How many did they accept? And the reasons. So that visibility, that goes a long way in addressing privacy in the risk of fear of surveillance. In relation to risks from the private sector agent, well, the solutions reside in the procurement contract. There has to be key terms that hold the private sector actor, agent, partner accountable. And one example is in Barcelona. Vodafone provides the infrastructure for Barcelona's smart city. So Vodafone must report in machine readable format every month to Barcelona City Hall the data it has collected. So that's one solution to addressing fear of surveillance by the private sector actor. Then data breach. Well, of course, data breach is a matter of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity experts recommend that funding be raised and that municipalities share information on cybersecurity to help each other. But again, going back to the example of Barcelona, Barcelona uses blockchain to protect the personal information it gathers. Then there's another issue that came out in Barcelona and also came out in Quayside, and that's the issue of data sovereignty, which is that the local population, in this case in Canada, entirely refused that the personal data that would have been gathered by Sidewalk Labs would have been stored in the United States and therefore accessible to law enforcement authorities in the United States. And so the solution to that concern was, again, it would have been in the procurement contract that Sidewalk Labs would have had to store personal data collected through its digital innovations in Canada.
Chantel, this is a fascinating discussion, and I really enjoyed also your recent think tank webinar on privacy and data sharing, where you joined with some of our experts globally to discuss this really vital issue. And it does have to be solved on the front end. So your message here is truly timely. It's sad to see what happened with Sidewalk Labs, and really a curable set of circumstances, but they needed to address them much earlier and compromise with the city and receive the social license that you have described. Emma Hand and I and our Smart Cities team at Dentons have really been recommending front-end processes where we meet with stakeholders from all interested stakeholders and set up a formal process to do that with the local governing authorities. But that was, thank you for that splendid discussion. And Fred Bonewell has been able to join us. Fred has the job where everyone comes to Fred with all of the tough issues. Fred is the Chief Security, Safety and Gas Solutions Officer at CPS Energy in San Antonio. CPS, as we heard with Paula Gold-Williams yesterday, is the largest municipally owned electric and gas system in the United States. And it has among the highest bond rating category of any utility in the United States. And as I mentioned with Paula Gold-Williams in my introduction yesterday, they've had to substantially enlarge their trophy case to house all of the recent awards that CPS has been winning, and Paula and Fred Bonewell has been winning with respect to safety and other areas. Fred has been doing groundbreaking work with respect to cyber security. He'll tell us a little bit about teaming up with Joint Base San Antonio and receiving the first utility authorized modeling on this subject. Fred has more than 30 years of leadership experience in his field, and he too has too many awards and distinctions to be able to list now. In addition to cyber, Fred has been the leader for CPS on their pandemic response. Texas is now a hotspot. San Antonio was doing very well for a while, but now is very hot with respect to the COVID. And Fred also has done some really innovative work with respect to renewable natural gas projects. So Fred, I don't know where you would like to start. You might want to start with with cyber and what you're doing with Joint Base San Antonio, and we can move on to these other topics.
Yes, Clint, it's a pleasure always to visit with you and spend part of the day with you and your colleagues here on this broadcast. It's a wonderful opportunity. Thank you. I'm privileged to be a part of this. I'll mention a couple of things. First, I will mention the project we have with Joint Base San Antonio. Some of you may not know, Joint Base San Antonio is the largest military joint base in the United States here in San Antonio. It comprises 12 different sites here in and around Bexar County. We have the privilege of being the 7th largest city, and we serve over 1 million customers in and around the surrounding cities. And part of that is Joint Base San Antonio. They are, in fact, our #1 customer. So when we think about hardening our assets, we think about first, how do we do that to ensure the connectivity and the resiliency with respect to Joint Base San Antonio? Because quite frankly, if we were to take an attack, or if we had an electromagnetic pulse event, which we know will come, it's a matter of time, we've got to be ready. And ERCOT is one of the 3 grid operators in the country, and we have the very precious assets of Joint Base San Antonio. So we not only have a strategic alignment with national security, we also have the ability to, should one of the grids go down, we could play a very big role in black start as it relates to any of the other grids that are connected to us on the perimeter. So we have entered into a long-term relationship with them. And last year, we were pleased to accept a long-term contract for the operation of those assets of electric and gas on the property of Joint Base San Antonio for the next 50 years. So we have a very unique relationship with them. It's very collaborative. It really started in a uniqueness way about 2 years ago. So we started the conversation with a white piece of paper, and we just absolutely talked about what are we going to do? What can we do to increase our relationship, to harden the grid, to be more effective with cybersecurity? And that's really how the conversation started. So we now have, through the efforts of the Alamo Area Council of Governments, what we call ACOG, we have entered into a first phase of grid hardening that deals with a military component to harden our substations that connect with the joint base, as well as airspace safety upgrades to allow for air assets to not be compromised with the current position of those assets to overhead lines. So this is all part of what they call DAG funding, which is to ensure to the best extent that we can the long-term resiliency and sustainability of Joint Base San Antonio as it exists today. So we just received that grant funding, and ACOG was the catalyst for that grant for these upgrades. And these upgrades will occur over a 2-year period of time. This is just really the beginning, though. The real hardening project begins on what we call Circuit 1. I'm not able to describe that in detail for confidentiality reasons, but we have been working with Department of Homeland Security, Department of Energy, and the Department of Defense on this first-of-a-kind project that will harden Circuit 1, that will enable to, in the event of any strike or any attack from a nation state, we will ensure the viability of those assets in any type of strike or event, up to and include electromagnetic pulse event. So that is a long-term project. It probably is a 5 to 10-year project. Quite frankly, we've been a little bit slow due to COVID. A lot of the assets in terms of funding have been slowed, and they've been diverted to other national interests, as you might imagine, with the protection around COVID-19. So we're still in the queue. We've actually been labeled as the first pilot project under the DoD for this particular effort. So when we talk about hardening multi-services, when we talk about protecting our grid, when we talk about ensuring that we're resilient from any hacker attempt, to us as a municipal utility, as the largest municipal utility in the United States, we have to do this in a collaborative way. We can't take this all alone on our own hand. As Chantel pointed out, municipals are strained significantly in our ability to be holistic ourselves. So we've got to build these partnerships, these collaborative environments where we can help draw from each other. So that's what we've done here in building the Circuit One project. It's a community effort, but beyond this, though, we have built other uniqueness with our partners. For example, we have entered into an agreement that we just signed here recently on the development of a regional security operations center. That is a collaborative effort. It's a joint project between us and the city of San Antonio. We are a 50% partner in this endeavor. And so what this is going to be able to allow us to do is ultimately be able to share a security operations center together 24/7, 365, where we can talk about threat actors, where we can talk about the latest threats and the latest defense techniques that we need to deploy. And that we can also take some of these conversations in a top secret environment should those needs come up with local law enforcement, FBI, or the Secret Service. So we have a lot of capability with this. We're excited about this Regional Security Operations Center. It's going to go on Port San Antonio property. It will go live in about 18 months. But this is a joint venture with them, and it's real exciting because it parlays very much what we're doing with Joint Base San Antonio around Circuit One. So that will actually provide us some ability in the future to be able to control some of our assets from a remote location. Should we have a hurricane, should we have another weather event, or another pandemic that's even worse than the one we have now. Frankly, I don't think this is the only pandemic that we're ever going to see in our lifetime. So we have to be ready for that. We have to be proactive, and we need to be thinking preventatively, long-term, to be able to create sustainability for our community around grid resiliency. So I'm really excited about this opportunity. This has also created a magnet, if you will, of cyber expertise here in between what we call the cyber corridor between us and Austin, which was really a vision of our CEO, Paula Williams, many months ago. And now that we've seen some of this come to life, this vision is becoming a reality. And so ultimately what it's going to do, it's going to create more of a vector and convergence of cyber expertise here in our community so that we can help build this even greater and even better than what it is now. To a large extent, even though this is a lot on paper, it's still very much a reality, and it's what we're working towards every day. So I just got off a call with Joint Base San Antonio. This project is very well alive, and it's a matter of time. COVID has kind of supplanted some of these investment opportunities, but I think we'll get over that hump. Hopefully it appears there's a vaccine on the horizon. So by the midtime next year, I think we'll check in again and we'll have even more success to report on what we're doing. But that is kind of it in brief, Clint. I hope that hit on a lot of the things you were looking for through this panel. Thank you.
Really helpful, Fred. I hope that city and community leaders that are listening to this, very few that I have spoken with are teaming up with the military installations in or proximate to their cities, which is, you have sort of provided a model for that. And for utility executives listening to this, I'm not sure how many utilities have teamed up with their local cities and military bases to form the type of joint headquarters you've described, and the type of cooperative work you're doing. Funding is always a critical issue, and this you have given us kind of a master class in how to share funding and also receive, have the ability to receive tremendous advice from the Department of Defense and organizations that have very, very advanced technology and advanced measures on the subjects we're talking about. And when you spoke about Black Start earlier, what you meant was in situations where a portion of the grid outside of ERCOT, the Texas grid, go down, you would have an ability to not just fast start, but start and provide them electricity where they may not be able to start their own facilities. So Fred, let me ask you very, very quickly, maybe just for a minute or two, tell us a little bit about your pet project with renewable natural gas.
This is really exciting, Clint. So this has been an opportunity where one of our customers came to us about 18 months ago, and now that I'm in charge of gas solutions for the company, this was really opportunistic. So the connectivity here is with a local landfill. And so, as you know, landfills blow that biogas off into the atmosphere and it's not collected. So this opportunity came to us in the sense of this off-taker has the option to and is going to build a filtration facility to filter the gas, and ultimately after about a 13-month period, that will be pipeline quality gas and it will be injected into our system directly. So ultimately, we have a long-term strategy also with a local transportation authority, of which ultimately they and us will be able to derive what's called renewable energy credits from the EPA. So that will give us a small nominal boost, if you will, to our revenues. But really it does more than that. It protects us. It gives us the ability to optionalize gas for the first time in 160 years, because we've really never changed the nameplate, if you will, on how we've delivered gas until now. And it gives our customers the ability to reflect that we are part of this community, we are part of the sustainability of this community, and we have the ability to help develop climate change as a result of this small project and others that will come about as a result of it. So it's really exciting. Even if that transportation customer were to go away, we still have the long-term fuel aspect and the connection to the landfill. So that's still going to be alive and well regardless. So this is truly exciting opportunity. It's groundbreaking. It's the first time we've had an RNG project in South Texas from Austin South. So I'm really excited to be part of this. And there's, as you probably know, a lot of security aspects to this that we have to consider, particularly around data sharing and so forth. But we've created a really good template for that with the city of San Antonio and our collaborative partners. So we're excited about this opportunity, and I appreciate you asking that question.
Well, congratulations on that, Fred. We hope that many, many other systems are going to replicate what you're doing. It will have such an obvious and immediate benefit. This panel has really been spectacular. And I know that each of you are incredibly busy right now, and we've had to make some adjustments in schedule, but it was well worth it. And we're so glad that you could join us. You have given us wonderful insight, but also inspiring advice on what we need to be doing going forward. So Emma Hand is going to quickly close us out and tell you a little bit about what's going to happen tomorrow.
Well, this has been just a terrific panel, and a big thank you to all of our speakers today. I know our audience found this incredibly interesting, and such wonderful and insightful comments from everyone. A couple of the themes that we heard yesterday were on connectedness and preparedness, and the fact that the pandemic had really emphasized the need for both, to be connected to for the citizens to be connected to the governments, for the governments to be connected to their citizens, to the resources that they need to respond to events, and how smart technology can enable that kind of connectedness, and make sure that we're not leaving critical parts of our population behind as we try to move the world forward and recover. Today we heard a similar theme around connectedness, but more on the topic of coalitions and partnerships, and the need for sectors that have not historically worked together particularly well to start really pulling together and teaming up, for public-private partnerships, for utilities and LTE providers to be working together, for the utilities to be working with their customers on demand response type resources, for the government entities and the entities that are deploying smart city technology to be working with their customers ahead of time on privacy issues, on building trust with the community. And so, again, hearing a lot of themes around the need for people to be communicating with each other, to be connected to each other, to be working together on these issues. These are not issues we can solve if everyone sits in their own little silo and does their own traditional piece of work. And so I think in our panel today, we heard a tremendous amount of information about the types of partnerships and the types of reaching across boundaries that are starting to happen. And it's incredibly encouraging to hear and to see forming. In part because we keep talking about the next pandemic, the next big crisis, the next big emergency that's going to come along, and the need to really be prepared for that. And so, how we conquer the world's problems is going to be dramatically impacted by how well we all work together and coalition build and develop public-private partnerships and bring these interests that were formerly separate together to start talking to each other. And so that people say, well, that's not really my job, when you show up with a great idea that stretches across silos. And so, just terrific discussion today, and a big thank you to all of our panelists. Tomorrow is going to be a very exciting day as well. We have a keynote address from former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley, who's been doing a great deal of work on smart governance issues, and a public utilities fortnightly panel recognizing 5 of the communities that have been chosen to receive this year's fortnightly Smartest Utility Projects Award. And so we should hear about some very exciting projects that are happening on that panel as well. And with that, we thank you all and hope that we will see you all again tomorrow.
And we start at 11 tomorrow, I think, Emma, is that correct?
Yes, I believe that's correct.
So we wish you a great day. Stay safe. See you tomorrow. And thank you to this magnificent panel.